Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Nekton Submarine STEM 2020. We're delighted to have you with us. We've got a really fab live lesson for you today. We have Dr. Lucy Woodall, who will be talking to us all about mountains under the sea very shortly. But before we start, big shout out to Inmarsat, who are supporting Nekton Submarine STEM, and also to all of you who are at home or perhaps still at school watching. A big hi to everybody there. We have people tuning in from the UK, from Canada, from the USA, Spain, the Maldives, Switzerland, and India. And we have a couple of really important shout outs. We've got a shout out to ET Booth Middle School. Hi, everybody watching from there. We have a shout out to the Tech Pandas from India. So big hi to all the Tech Pandas. And a big shout out to all the staff and students at Bridge Mary School in the UK. Wonderful to have you with us, with a special mention for Scarlett, Caden, and Mia. So wonderful to have you with us for this. Just to give you a brief overview of what's coming up, we're going to have a wonderful talk by Lucy in just a moment. And that's going to last for about 15-20 minutes. And then the second half of this live lesson will be a chance to answer as many questions as we can. We've got some that have been pre-submitted already. Do remember that up to 24 hours before a live lesson, you can submit those by booking online on the Encounter EDU website. And then if you haven't submitted those, then we'll come on to the YouTube live chat, and we have our teacher moderators on there ready to help as well. A few house rules. This is a virtual classroom, so in terms of using the live chat, just remember to respect others and to behave in the same way as you would in a normal classroom. But without further ado, it's a big hello to Lucy. Hi, Lucy.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Jamie.
Lucy, you're a submarine explorer. You kind of go in this type of stuff, these kind of things, and you explore seamounts. And I think you've got a little sort of introduction to seamounts for us. Is that right?
Yes. So today I'm going to be explaining a little bit about the deep sea, about seamounts, what's down under our oceans, and some of the questions that we're still answering as we go down there as explorers and scientists.
Wonderful. I'll leave it to you. Take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. Some of you around the globe. I'm going to be talking about the deep ocean and seamounts. So we're going to be exploring what it's like below the surface of the ocean, especially in the deep sea. And we're going to be thinking about seamounts. These are our mountains under the ocean. We're going to be looking at where they are, what they are, and also what makes them special. So we'll look at a number of pictures with all the animals that live on them. So this is our first image. And you might say, well, Lucy, that looks very blue. And say, well, absolutely it does. This is what our planet looks like from space. So we can see there the island of Australia on the right-hand side, and that's quite red. We have Antarctic continent there down at the bottom. But what you can see very obviously is most of our planet is ocean. So in fact, we shouldn't be planet Earth. We really should be planet ocean. 70% of our planet is covered by the ocean. And this means that it's important for all life on Earth. Most of life lives in the ocean and not on land like us humans. And also the ocean is really important because it affects every process on the planet. And by this, I mean that our ocean impacts our weather conditions, what we're experiencing now, how our tides work, and all the currents and weather that comes across onto our land. So this is an image of what we could see if we drained all of our oceans and we could see what was on our seabed. So just take a moment now to look around where you live, and you'll be able to see some of the ridges going down through the oceans. You can see the mid-Atlantic ridge going down north to south in the Atlantic. You'll be able to see a lot of different ridges in the Pacific coming down from the bottom of the United States, down and around past South America, and then in the Indian Ocean, coming down and then splitting off east and west. So we have these ridges and these rises in the ocean. We also have really precise little mountains, and these are our seamounts, and we're going to explore these later on in this lesson. But we also have valleys, and these valleys or trenches are just like they are on land. They cut down into the sea floor. So we're now going to take a little bit more detailed look at the Indian Ocean, and this is where I spend a lot of my time working. And I believe we have people from Maldives, so a special hello to Maldives today. You can see the island nation of Maldives on the right-hand side of the screen, just by the bottom of the first arrow. And on this image, we can see our ridges. That's the arrow there in the middle, pointing to that line going down north to south. We can see some seamounts, and that's the arrow over to the left-hand side. And then one at the left-hand side at the bottom is a trench, and this is down by Seychelles. This is the Amarantes Trench. And all the way over on the right-hand side, that's just showing there is some flat areas. And we'll be looking a little bit at those as well today, so you can see the difference between flat areas of the ocean and those parts that are raised. So when we look at the sea floor, we can't look at the whole seamount at any one time. This is because they lay down more than 1,000 meters deep where no light from the surface touches. So instead, we visualize them on these big maps. And these are just like you would find on land. So on this map here of this seamount, we have red up at the summit of the seamount, and then each of the white lines is 100 meters deeper, all the way down through the colors of the rainbow, down to purple, which is about 2,400 meters. So you will see this seamount is about 2,000 meters from its base to its summit. Seamounts, by their definition, have to be over 1,000 meters from their base to their summit. But there's no rules about how close they are to the surface. So some, like the seamount I've got here, is just a few hundred meters down below the surface. Some of them are nearly at the top, and some, again, come all the way up to the surface. And of course, we call those islands. So I promised we would show you what the seabed looks like. And there it is. That's a flat bit of seabed. And the majority of our sea floor looks like this. It's rock at the bottom, but it's overlain with a lot of sediment. And when we look at that, you might think that there's not much living there. However, if you go and dig a little bit of that mud, you'll find hundreds and thousands, and in fact, millions of these. These are small nematode worms, and just an example of some of the animals that live in the sediment. The width of the image you can see there with the little nematode is about 2 millimeters. You can see they're very, very tiny, and I took this image under the microscope. On our sediment, we can also see some larger animals. So I'm going to introduce you here to the sea pig. That's on the right-hand side. That is a type of sea cucumber, and they go around the sediment, and they kind of hoover up all of the particles that come down in the marine snow. You can also see the pink rod that's going up from the middle of the screen, and this is a type of coral. This is a sea pen, and we'll come on to all the different types of coral later on. So remember that we've got that middle pink and then the fluffy bits off to the side, and it's these parts that pull out the water, the food in the water column, and they filter the food to give the sea pen some nutrition. And finally, you'll notice on this image that there's lots of brittle stars. These are types of sea stars, but they've got very long legs, and they use their legs to find food, and then they bring them into the mouths, which are underneath the plates that are in the middle of their bodies. So I've just shown you two images of what a lot of the seafloor looks like, but this is when it's covered with sediment. When it's not covered with sediment and it's a hard substrate, hard rock, then we find the most amazing corals. So just look carefully at this image, and every color, every shape that you can see on here is a different species of coral. So now we found out that coral doesn't just live at the surface in warm waters. We also have some coral living in sediment, and lots more of these type living on the rocks. And this is really important for us to know, because it's these corals that help provide homes for lots of different animals. And in this picture, we can see the wonderful soft octocoral in its pink there, looking like a tree. And this was about 2 meters across in both directions. And you can see there's snake sea stars that are using this coral as its home. You can also see a lot of other different types of corals, and very carefully, for example, at the bottom on the white-looking coral, you can see a sea urchin, the little pink blob. Everyone see that? So now we're going to zoom in on the tree-like octocoral, and there you can see them. Amazing. All of these snake sea stars winding their arms around the branches of the coral. On the left-hand side, you can see the tentacles of a sea anemone that's attached to the coral. And the coral itself, you can see all the little polyps. Those are the things that look furry off the edges of the pink structure. And it's these polyps that catch the food as it goes past in the water column. We don't just have soft corals down in the cold waters. We also have some cold water hard corals, and they make a hard skeleton, hence their name. They might look a little bit more like the corals that you could have seen in pictures, or even around your own coastlines in the shallow waters. But you can see here, they're kind of like thickets, and they provide homes for lots of other animals. Here specifically, you can see a little sea snail there in the middle. And you can also see lots of different types of sponges. If you look out to the back, they're the white objects that look almost see-through. Well, when we zoom in on these coral thickets, we can find a massive array of different animals. Here we can see a crab on the left-hand side, some more sea snails in there as well. A little urchin with its spines down there at the bottom. Do you see those white spines? And in the middle, has everyone got it? The fish that's right in the middle, and you can see both of its eyes looking out to you in the middle at the top. So as we can see here, these coral habitats that are formed on these underwater mountain seamounts are incredibly important because a lot of other life lives there. So that means that we've seen a lot of diversity of different corals, and we've seen that they provide homes for lots of other types of animals. However, They're not just home to sessile life, and that means life that's attached to the seabed. We also find a lot of different mobile predators that congregate at these seamounts. And this is because there's lots of food for them to eat. Whales are thought to use these seamounts to help them navigate their way around their long migrations and to help them know where they are. But I've shown you a few different types of animals that can congregate around seamounts. The first one I'm going to highlight is that of the albatross down there in the bottom. This is a picture I took when I was down in the Southern Ocean looking at seamounts quite a few years ago now. And we saw a lot of these albatross over the tops of the seamounts. Now, coming back into the water column, we see chimera. Have a look, see what you think that small fish in the picture is. What does it look like? Possibly a shark? Think it looks like a shark? Well, in fact, chimeras are types of sharks and closely related to sharks that you might have typically seen on television or even in the wild. And finally, we'll come on to the big picture. So this is an anglerfish living at depth. And it's adapted to live at depth. It's got that dark brown or black colour that almost looks velvety. And this is so it doesn't reflect any light. Living down deeper than about 1,000 meters means that the only light that's down there is light that's produced by the animals. It doesn't come from the sun. So the anglerfish uses this light, and little bacteria that are in its little light bulb above the mouth there, and there's a zoom in of it on the right-hand side, it acts like a lure and attracts other creatures into its mouth down at depth. So it can use light to help it feed. So finally, what do we now know about the ocean and seamounts? Well, the sea floor is not flat. You might have seen the surface of the water when you go down to the beach and it looks like this flat line. Well, actually, if we were to get rid of all that water, we'd see lots of valleys and mountains. And these are our trenches and our seamounts. Our seamounts like our ocean mountains. The seamounts connect the deep sea floor with shallower waters. That means there's lots of animals that live there, and they're connected from those that adapted to live in the deep and those who make their homes in shallow waters. We've also seen that most of the seafloor is flat and covered with a thick layer of mud. And a lot of the life that lives there is very, very small. However, when we get onto our seamounts, very different life grows there because it's hard and that life can attach to the rock. That life, like the corals that we saw, is home to lots more creatures. And this makes them hotspots for life in the ocean. So you've seen some pictures, and I think you've already got lots of questions for me. So finally, I want to share this slide. And this is me when I was exploring in the ocean. I'm in a submersible there, down around about 200 meters. Beyond me, you can see a garden of corals. And we had been out in the ocean and measuring what was living there, documenting the biology and measuring the physical and chemical parameters so we could understand much, much more about the life down at depth. So, Jamie, I'm going to hand back over to you, and I believe you've got lots of questions for me.
Of course, Lucy, thank you so much for that introduction to seamounts. Really amazing. Before we get into the questions that are coming over the live chat, and I know that now is a stage, so please do send in more on the questions that we've got already. I just wanted to ask you, because, I mean, this is probably something, you know, going in one of these, probably something that nobody watching has done. What is it like to go down in a submersible and look at this underwater world firsthand. How does it feel?
Yeah, thank you. So it is an amazing privilege. And I think for me, the best aspect of this is that the ocean feels part of my world. I don't feel removed from it when I'm in it. So it's just like when we're swimming around, maybe, if we can do that. So that's really important. But as we go down from the surface down into the deeper waters, the first thing we notice is that it gets quite quiet. Those things that we're used to from the surface, they disappear. It gets cooler actually quite quickly as the light disappears. So the amount of light and the light, the waves of light change. So to get the proper colors, you have to shine a torch on things. Everything looks really blue and green, like our backgrounds today. And then as we go deeper and deeper, the light goes down even more, so it almost turns black. And the type of light and the type of life changes. So we go from a very busy reef with lots of colour into a reef that's more muted colours and different types of life down there. So in that particular expedition where I showed you that picture at the end, we found a whole habitat, a whole area of ocean that we didn't know existed before. And these corals we found there were black corals. And they were really common, but totally new to science. So I think for me, that's really important, right? If we're asking those questions and we're finding things so readily that are new, we ask ourselves really, wow, there is so much still to find. And I think that's really exciting when I talk to these younger audiences, these explorers in the future. There is so many questions for you to be able to go and ask.
So, Lucy, thank you. I mean, just to go to some of the pre-submitted questions we've got from E.T. Booth, we've got one I'd like to know, which is what is the craziest creature you've ever seen?
Oh gosh, craziest creature. Well, I think a lot of them are pretty crazy because they're all adapted to live down at depth. And this means, of course, they don't look like us humans because we're pretty well adapted for walking around on land. But of course, in the ocean, they have to get their oxygen from the water rather than from air. And often they're specifically adapted to live at pressure and in low light, like the anglerfish that I showed you in one of those last slides. I do have a bit of a favourite, though, and this is a crinoid. So this is kind of similar to a sea star that we might find in our rock pools. They're related, but instead of the very defined arms, they've got like feathers. So we can also call them feather stars. And they swim through the water column. I'm going to do a mime. Guys, ready? Kind of like this. And when I first saw one, I thought it was an alien. Like, it was so amazing seeing this thing move down at depth. So I think for me, that stays with me. The swimming feather star.
A swimming feather star. Incredible. And I mean, they look absolutely stunning and slightly alien-like at the same time. Well, I'm just going to sort of there's this whole range of different questions that are coming through. There's a few around the deep sea. So what I'm going to try and group them together. We've got how deep is the deepest point in the ocean from Talia? Mm-hmm. And then Arthur would like to know how deep you have dived or maybe even want to dive.
Yeah, good questions. Yes, so we didn't touch on some of our deepest points, but that's over 11 kilometers deep in the Marianas Trench. And the Marianas Trench is in the northern Pacific, near the Marianas Islands, kind of south of Japan. So if we can think about that in our minds, or if we can point to it on a wall, if someone's got a map there. So that's the the deepest point we found. Of course, there are deep points in every one of our oceans, because we saw those trenches in that map that I showed earlier. They go across the globe. So, for example, in the Mediterranean, we have the Calypso Deep. That doesn't go quite as deep. But these deep areas are equally as important as our seamounts because they harbour really different life. Well, how deep have I been? So I've been to just over 300 metres. So that doesn't sound very deep at all when we're thinking about 11 kilometres. But in fact, it takes a lot of technology to allow us to go deep. If we think about we're swimming, we're on the surface. And then if maybe we've got snorkeling gear, we can maybe get down to maybe 5-10 metres. With our scuba diving, maybe we're looking at 30 or 40 metres deep. The submersibles that I've been in, like the picture I showed you, the maximum depth for that is round about 300 metres, and that's what I've been in. Now, the plan at the moment was for me to be diving a lot deeper than that, and I should have been in the Indian Ocean, diving down to about 4,000 metres in a submersible that is a one-of-a-kind and specially designed to go all the way down to the very deepest parts of our ocean. So how deep would I like to go? Well, of course, being an ocean explorer and a fan of the ocean and what life lives in it, I'd love to go everywhere all the time. But in fact, what I really love to do is share the deep ocean with others. So I would be really happy never getting in another submersible as long as I could share that with other people. And we really hope to do that with our partners in Seychelles and Maldives, which is the island nations that we're currently working with.
Brilliant. And it seems like, the Explorers Around the World is really special, which takes us on to two other questions that have come through. The first from Tech Pandas is what's the biggest mountain under the sea? And I'm trying to remember who answered this, but it's a great question. Are there seamounts that formed from under the sea and then came above the sea, and then they had terrestrial life on it, and then have submerged again, and you can find sort of terrestrial fossils on top? Does that happen? Do things change over time?
Yes, really good questions. So largest seamount by sort of mass is quite hard to know because we just haven't mapped all of the ocean well enough. Our biggest seamount is one in the Hawaiian Emperor chain, Mauna Kea, and that's obviously over in the Pacific near Hawaii. So coming back to this question of can we get islands, can they go back down again? We understand this is the case in a few really special situations where seamounts have risen up. They've had accumulations of things like coral on, so they've created the coral islands. And then over time with sea level change, then they have then descended again. And this is sort of in line with previous glaciations. I would say this is something that is still being studied because, of course, as I said, we need really special technologies. And that was obviously a focus on some of the talk yesterday and will be throughout the week. Because we need special technologies and because it's quite limited and there's only a few of us marine scientists around, then there's still a lot to discover to really understand about how these changes across decades and even into much sort of further back than that, and how that sort of changes our ocean.
Amazing, Lucy, and those quite long scales of changes as well. I think what we've got quite a few questions coming in about coral, because obviously coral people might know from Finding Nemo, and then you've been showing deep coral that you find on seamounts and at depth. I think I'll just go through them one by one. But the first question I think is: are there just two types of coral, which is shallow coral and deep coral, or is it more complicated than that? Or complex. Even.
Well, it's biology, so it's definitely more complex than that. So coral itself is very diverse. Jamie, you've been able to explain, we've got our shallow water coral, and we've seen some different types of deep water coral today. But there's a lot of variety. And of course, there is a huge amount of variety, because remember, our ocean is huge, and it's had millennia to adapt and evolve, to live in very precise and special locations. So in some ways, it would be kind of surprising if there wasn't a huge array of different species. So we can have some black corals, we have bamboo corals, we have our soft corals, our light-loving corals as well. And I think, for me, these different corals are living in these different places that they've adapted to. But the real difference is that in the shallows, they're light-loving, and they live with a little algae in the coral, is a symbiote, so therefore the coral and the algae benefit from the relationship. The algae provides energy from light, and it gives that to the coral, and in turn, the coral houses the algae. However, at depth, when we don't have that light, the coral has to rely on picking up food from the water that goes past it. And whether that's got a hard skeleton, like some of those thickets we saw at the end, or whether it's more tree-like, like that pink octocoral we saw in the pictures as well.
Amazing. Sorry, I was just, we had a little bit of audio there. So, I mean, we've got questions coming through. I think a number of viewers have heard in the media about coral reefs disappearing, or they're being damaged to coral, or the decreasing coral coverage. I think first of all, is that happening, and should we be concerned? And then second, is that also happening for the deep sea coral communities that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so that's a really important aspect for us globally. And what we find is that our coral reefs are heavily impacted by our activities as humans. And one of those is our release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is causing climate change. And this climate change is doing a lot of things to our oceans. It's warming it up. It's causing the ocean to be a little bit more acid. And it's reducing the amount of oxygen. So when we have our temperature increases, this causes some stress for the coral. It's not what it's adapted to live in. And this means our little algae get stressed. Remember, they're the things that provide the energy for these corals that live up at the surface. And when these algae get stressed, the coral expels them, right? It's just trying to get rid of everything, trying to get rid of all the additional parts. So that's what we call coral bleaching. And if that happens for a long period of time, those little algae don't ever come back. And then the coral has lost its way to provide its energy. So that's what is a major cause of the reduction in our reefs. Also, with slightly more acid ocean, it means it's harder to build those skeletons, those hard shells that are around the coral. And with a little bit less oxygen, again, that's a highly stressful environment. So all of these things added up, plus maybe things like pollution, add to this state that where we're reducing the diversity and the health of our coral systems. So it's absolutely essential that we try and get a handle on this. We protect our reefs as much as we can so that others in the future are able to both enjoy them, but also benefit off them from their protection, because they're very important in things like storms. What was the second part of that question, Jamie?
Well, it's whether that, there's quite wide coverage of the damage being done to shallow coral reef. And we've talked a lot about deep coral reef. Are we seeing the same thing happening at depth?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, and something that's actually really important for us to think about. So if you think about those three aspects that I spoke about for climate change, so we have the temperature increase, we have oxygen decrease, and we have slightly more acid. So things like temperature, when we get down into the deeper ocean, that's not as felt as acutely because there's not the same relationship between the coral and the algae. Okay, so we don't get the same forms of bleaching. And remember, the energy of those corals at depth, that comes from the food that's coming past in the water column and not from the sunlight. But when we're thinking about the other two aspects, the decrease in oxygen and the increase in acidification, which means that it's harder for the corals to grow, then we do believe that these are impacting the coral reefs. However, I can't sit here and tell you how much because really we don't know. And what we've seen is that we're only just starting to understand these deep water systems. So that's one of the reasons why when we go to sea, we want to document these amazing coral gardens so that there is a baseline for researchers in the future, just like everyone watching here today, to go out and do that comparison.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And there was a lot of questions on that. The next set of questions is going back really to the geology where we started of seamounts. And I'm going to sort of combine questions through from Andrew, Cameron, and Maddie. Maddie over in Australia at the moment. Cameron starts off with seamount formation. And then Andrew and Maddie are concerned about the stability of seamounts and whether there's ever been an occurrence of a seamount collapsing and causing a tsunami.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. Fantastic. Really interesting questions. Okay, so let me start firstly briefly talking about the formation of seamounts. So these seamounts are formed from essentially the fracture zones where these ridges are, and they're essentially the joins of our tectonic plates. So this is where a bit of the sea floor, the crust, has been pushed up, and that creates the seamount. There's a few other ways, but that's the common one. So when we're thinking about can we get like sort of landslips underwater? Well, we actually do see those, and we see evidence of past ones. So if you remember that image, that rainbow color image I showed you that showed you the top of the seamount in red and coming down through the rainbow to purple around the bottom. When we look at those types of images that we create through our echo sounder on the ships, we can sometimes see valleys and grooves, and almost like something's come in and chomped a bit away. And this is where you have a situation where a bit of the edge of the seamount has ended up sort of slumping away. So just like on land, we have erosion in the water. Now, it doesn't happen to the same extent because of a lot of erosion in water happens through a process of freezing and thawing, and that breaks up the little gaps into bigger gaps. Of course, in the ocean, we don't have any freezing or thawing, but we do have tidal cycles. We have big storms coming through in our monsoons, or even through in the winter as well, in different areas across the globe. So we do see this. Now, coming on to things like tsunamis, we think that there's evidence of that happening previously, but it's really quite hard to tell by some of the evidence that we have because we're trying to piece together a lot of historic aspects and trying to find out what's happened at the same time. And just because we find things happening at the same time doesn't mean to say there's a cause and effect. This is the difference between our correlation and our causations. I'm sure that's been a topic of conversation in some of your science lessons in the past. So just because we find things together doesn't mean to say that they're there because of each So lots more work still going on with that, and really interesting questions for our explorers of the future.
Brilliant. And I mean, is it physically possible for what we're talking about is sort of a massive landslip to cause a tsunami? Is that kind of event something that could cause it?
Yeah, so that's definitely not my area of expertise, being a biologist. But we know that a tsunami essentially is when a large mass of water is moved at the same period of time. And we've definitely seen that from previous earthquakes. We've seen large trenches open up, which we think has moved a lot of water at the same time. So I would say, there's all these systems are very complex, and something that we think is really big, for example, maybe the sizes of the rooms that we're in today, if that amount of earth was to move on land, that seems huge. But in comparison with the size of the ocean, that's just like a tiny water drop.
Got it. This question is, in fact, going back a bit from Rebecca, who would like to know whether the submersibles are comfortable and how long you actually spend in them.
Brilliant question. Yes. So I'm there in my picture, and I'm smiling because I'm looking at the seabed, but in fact, it's a very, very small space. We have a pressure sphere that we sit in the shallower submersibles, like the one in the image. They are clear all the way around, but in the submersible that goes down to full ocean depth, then that's metallic. So when you get inside, generally 2 people in the pressure sphere, but we've got to get all the equipment in there as well. So it's not just for us to sit back. So we have chairs in there, kind of small chairs, maybe just like ones that you'd sort of size that you'd use in school. So not like big ones that you might use if you're watching TV. And then you've got a very small space to put your feet, because right in front of you there is the rest of the sphere. So quite small. Of course, there's at least 2 of you in there, so you get to know each other very well. How much time do we spend in there? Well, that really depends about the depth, because if you can imagine, the deeper you go, the longer you have to spend in there, because it takes a long time to go from the surface all the way down into the deep sea. And the dives that the team were doing in the Marianas Trench, they were down there for many hours, like 8-9 hours. The longest dive I've done is 6 hours. That was particularly unusual. We were doing a lot of different operations, but it was 6 hours at about 200 meters. So we saw a lot of fish at that point, saw a lot of groupers. They're very inquisitive. Yeah, I think the most important thing to think about is that, you're kind of in a reverse fishbowl, right? We've had to keep all of the things that allow humans to survive at the surface. We've had to put that down at depth. So it's very important. There's a lot of equipment in there, things to remove CO2, to add oxygen. And of course, the air is very dry. So you want to have a drink all of the time. You want to be there with your water bottle.
But you maybe there are other reasons why you might not drink so much.
Right, you definitely have to limit it, yes.
Lucy,
an opportunity to go to the bathroom in the back.
Okay. Lucy, this has been amazing. We've got time for 2 more questions, and they're both on fish. Emma would like to know what you think the prettiest fish is. And Sharonia would like to know what kind of fish you might find if you went diving down in the Mariana Trench.
Okay, so I'm going to do the last question first and then finish on what I think the prettiest fish is, or maybe my favorite. So down in the Marianas Trench, right down in the very deepest areas, we don't see any fish. And this is because their physiology, how they're made up, their biology doesn't allow them to go that deep. So we see some fish going down very deep, but not right in the bottom. instead of fish, we find things like giant isopods, like the little wood lice that we can find in and around wood piles or on beaches. And they're this size on land. And then in the trenches, they're this big. They end up, and a lot of organisms end up being really big when we get down deep because they have quite stable conditions. So down to the prettiest, or maybe my favorite. So now we go back a few years to my studies for my doctorate. And this was on seahorses. And little seahorses, absolutely, I think, are my favorite. They don't look like regular fish. They have this little head pointing forward, this little tail coming underneath. So they hold on to things. And when I was doing my studies, I'd have a look at them, and sometimes they'd come up and hold on to my little finger. So we say they're a friendly fish because they like to hold your hand. And I think that's a really lovely aspect. They're absolutely fascinating, and happy to answer any other questions offline on them. But a really unique fish that lives in our shallower waters, but down to a few hundred meters, and it lives all the way across the globe. So all of us that live in our coastal waters might be able to see them at some point. Although they're quite hard to see because they're very well camouflaged.
Lucy, that sounds like a fabulous idea. We'd love to have you back to just do a whole session on seahorses. And Brilliant. That would be amazing. We'll talk afterwards, because I'm sure all the people watching would love to hear more about seahorses too. But just to say thank you so much for helping out, coming online today, talking about the amazing underwater world, and sharing all that with all our viewers at home. Now, just to remind people, we've got 3 great talks left this week on Nekton Submarine STEM 2020. We have tomorrow, we've got Exploring the Deep, and that's finding out about all the different people involved in this kind of exploration. We then have a very special talk on Thursday with Patrick, who is one of only 8 people to have gone to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And he's going to be talking about the engineering and technology of submarines and submersibles. And then on Friday, the all-important piece, which is how do we turn all of this into conserving and protecting our ocean? How can we use the data to inform conservation efforts? So that's really, really important and exciting topic on Friday. So do join us then. But just to say, and I know we're going to have huge amounts of thanks online. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all those great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through every single one, but do join us again. And thank you for taking part. So it's goodbye from Submarine Live for now. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.